Jesus where you just really blew it? I mean, here we are at the end of the week, where we've already covered, the cross of forgiveness for sins and Jesus finishing it and offering us freedom and access and relationship to him. And yet we come to this scene in John 21 with Peter, and failure is still a part of the picture. And I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of these moments. I kind of like after the cross, after salvation encounter with Jesus, a moment where I just really blew it. I remember being a sophomore in college, and I had been following Jesus since I was young, but I was learning a lot of new stuff about him, and I was involved in InterVarsity, and they invited me to be a small group Bible study leader, and I'd never been afraid of a leadership role before I got into InterVarsity, and I thought I could really screw people up, trying to lead them spiritually. It wasn't the same as the other stuff I led in. And I just remember being, scared and terrified, but I was like, yeah, I'm not, I was like you probably this week, and I was like, yeah, okay, I'll do it, So I started leading a Bible study. But I got into this really weird place in my sophomore year where I was involved with InterVarsity, and I was leading a Bible study, and I think I always led the most awkward Bible studies of anyone on campus, I had the girl that would sit on the bed, not open her Bible, and stare at the wall for the entire thing, not say a word. And she came every week, and I don't know, it's a sidebar, it's not important, but those were the kind of Bible studies that I ended up with. But I ended up in this weird place where I was involved with InterVarsity, and I was leading a small group Bible study, but my primary community was not this community of believers. I was a music student, and for those of you who study the arts in college of any kind, it's this intense experience that you're thrown into from the beginning of your freshman year where they are your life. And you are with them all day, every day. And this group of non-believers had really, I didn't realize it had become my primary community. And so I was talking to them about Jesus. I wanted, them to know Jesus, and I was sharing that with them. But at the same time, some things began to break down in me where I was really wrestling with, I don't know, some kind of deep melancholy or depression and a sense of loneliness. I'd always been kind of good at stuff that I did, and I got to college, and it just kind of wrecked my world. The achiever in me was just I am at the bottom of the totem pole. And my identity began to unravel, and I did not know what to do with myself. But I wasn't going to this community of believers that God had given me to deal with that. I was with this community of non-believers. And while I was out of one side of my mouth talking to them about Jesus, on the other side, I was dealing with my sense of loneliness and hopelessness in the ways that they were. And I began, for me, it was drinking. I began to drink when I was with them. It was this weird thing. I'm embarrassed to talk about it, but I worked at a hotel, and it wasn't just drinking, I was stealing. This friend of mine and I, we would steal alcohol from the parties that we served, and we would drink at work, and heavily, and it was just embarrassing, and then I would go be with my school of music friends, and I would drink with them, and overdo it, and then I would be the next week in Bible study, trying to lead OIA and trying to tell people they should follow Jesus with their whole life. And I just remember the way I began to break down and just feel the split in my soul, as I tried to be these two people and talk about Jesus being the hope of the world, but dealing with my hopelessness in some other way. And I remember beginning to share that with a staff worker, confessing that to them, and then eventually sharing it with my whole leadership team. And I don't know if you can imagine the amount of shame and guilt that I felt, the feeling of being unusable in God's work on campus, of not being trustworthy, having betrayed a community of friends and the work that we were trying to do on campus. And having to tell them and having to put it out in the open and feeling the distance between me and Jesus and feeling the distance between me and them because of this deep dualism that had begun to exist inside of me. If you can grasp those emotions inside of you, those are the emotions that we have to bring to the beginning of this passage as we understand the context of this interaction between Jesus and Peter. Just to give you a little bit of background, of where Peter has come from. Some of you know his story really well. Peter, I always imagined Peter as kind of this big, brutish guy. I don't know, the guys off Deadliest Catch, just gnarly and bearded and, haven't showered in weeks. And I don't know why. It's just my image of Peter that I carry with me. And Peter's impulsive, and he's always just shooting off at the mouth among the disciples and among Jesus. midway through John, he makes this declaration. Jesus is predicting his death and talking about people denying him. He's like, Jesus, not me. I will be with you forever. I will never turn my back on you, Jesus. And in that moment, it's a solemn moment. It's a foreshadowing when Jesus, he doesn't call him Peter, he calls him Simon. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. And he tells him, you will deny me before this is over with. You'll turn your back on me. Just weeks later, standing in the middle of the night, warming himself by a charcoal fire, a young girl begins to ask him about his acquaintance with Jesus. And maybe even before he realizes what he's doing, he begins to say, I don't know who you're talking about. I'm not associated with that man. And 3 times, 3 brutal times, he denies his friendship with Jesus, and he hears the rooster crow. And don't you imagine that shame flooded his existence. Jesus' death happens, the crucifixion happens, the resurrection happens, and Jesus begins to appear to the disciples. And before we come, I never caught on to it before, but before we came to this part in the text, Jesus has already appeared to them twice. He's already been with the disciples. He's already shown them his body, and they've touched him, and they've been reunited with him. And I don't know why, guys, but in my mind, I just always thought that was like an awesome moment where they were like dogpiling Jesus. And it was like, you're back! This is awesome! This is incredible! But as I realized that happened, and then this scene that we're about to get into happened, I just felt like, wow, I really got the tone of that first reunion wrong. Because I think they were excited to see Jesus that first time that he revealed himself to them. And they were in awe, and they were glad that Jesus was back from the dead. But I just wonder if they didn't hesitate a little. If they didn't carry with them the distance that they felt in their heart because of what had transpired over those nights leading up to Jesus' death. So they were glad, but they were afraid. And maybe carried with them this shame. And it's weird because after Jesus appeared to them that time, do you remember he told them to stay in Jerusalem and wait for the Holy Spirit? Do you remember that? We get to John 21. They're not in Jerusalem. They're in Galilee. It's a ways away from Jerusalem. And yet, they had been told to wait. And here is Peter with these 5 or 6 other disciples. And I imagine Peter having been the one to lead this trip to Galilee. Even in this passage as it begins, we see that Peter's there, and he's the one that decides to get in the boat and go fishing again. And the other disciples follow him. He is a leader, and he has led them away from this place, encounter with Jesus. And I think they all must have felt a great deal of shame and regret and distance from Jesus, but I think Peter felt it more than anyone, because he had such a big mouth, And he overpromised and he underdelivered, and he was the only one that beat his breast and said, Jesus, I will never leave you. And he said it in front of everyone. They heard it, So they had said it too. They hadn't declared it out loud. Peter had. So I imagine they felt shame, but I imagine that Peter felt it more profoundly in some way. And he had been so close to Jesus all those years. He had been with him as he sat at the wedding in Cana. He had been with him as he fed the 5,000 on the hill that day. And he had been with him as he healed people and as he called people to lose their lives. And Peter was one of the only 3 that was with him at the Transfiguration when they got to see him there on the mountain. And he was there at that Last Supper, in that intimate interaction with Jesus. He had been so close to him. And Peter, we know that he is just impulsive and capricious, but Jesus loved him. And Peter always knew that. And always knew he could just be himself and be close to him. But in this moment, I think, that first encounter before the John 21 scene when Jesus revealed himself, I just think there hung in the air a thickness of shame and embarrassment. Peter, he could not bear it. And even though he had been asked to wait, he decided to go back home to Galilee because Jesus had been resurrected from the dead, you guys. And they were glad about it, no doubt. But Peter had not been resurrected from his failure yet. He could not deal with what he had done. He thinks maybe this was a good run while it lasted, me hanging out with Jesus. And, I just don't think I am who Jesus thought I was after all. I don't really think I can be a leader. He probably doesn't even want me anymore. Maybe he wants them to wait in Jerusalem for the Holy Spirit, but probably not me. And I would probably just screw it up, what he's trying to do in the world anyways. maybe all along it was like just a little bit too much to believe that whole like kingdom coming and transformation and new life and you can fish for men stuff. And maybe that whole thing about me being a rock, maybe that was just like, it was a beautiful dream, but I don't think I'm the right guy. I'm too wishy-washy. I'm too impulsive, and I will just let him down again. And so Peter hangs his head, and in his heart, he just decides, let me go back home. Let me go back to fishing. I know how to do that. It makes sense to me. That is a comfortable place for me. And that's the place where we begin this scene in John 21. Peter back on the water, fishing, the place he was before Jesus found him. There's this attraction in the middle of Florida. For any of you who live in Orlando or have been to Orlando, it's a pretty well-known place, and one particular part of it looks like a large golf ball sitting in the midst of the beautiful Florida landscape. Years ago, back in the 60s, I think, Walt Disney, he had the park in California already, and he began to dream about another place that wouldn't just be a theme park, but it would be like a futuristic city. And he would call it the Experiment Prototype Community of Tomorrow. And he wanted this place to be a fully functional city of the future. It's about 47 square miles of land in the middle of Florida, of all places. I don't know why, but in his imagination, this city of the future, it was real, you guys. You can go online and find it. I'll tell you where later. There's like a whole video that he made before he died about the city and these pictures, and it's just gorgeous. It's like these tall buildings in the middle, and the city just, it goes out in a circle. It radiates out from the center. And he wanted it to have 20,000 residents. This was his dream, that it would have 20,000 residents, and that it would be the test bed for city planning and organization of the future. It would be a community that was built in the shape of a circle, and in the middle would be like the businesses and the commerce, and outside of that would be places for community and recreation, and then outside of that would be the places of residence. And there would be no like vehicles in that place. They would have like a people mover. Some of you might know it as the monorail, or what do they call that thing at Epcot? Is it the monorail? Yeah. There'd be a people mover that would take people across the city, so that pedestrians could kind of have the right-of-way there in this place of the future. And cars would travel underground, and there would be like double layers. Like one layer would be for like small automobiles, and then the next layer would be like for big trucks and stuff like that. And he had it perfectly designed in these like circular shapes under this circular city, so that there wouldn't need to be a traffic light that would ever disturb the flow of traffic. How awesome would that be, It was awesome. I'm just looking at it, and I'm reading about it, and He'd even thought about how like garbage would be handled in the city, that would be different from anything that anyone had ever seen before. And he said this about it. He said that Epcot will take its cue from new ideas and new technologies that are emerging from the forefront of American industry. It will be a community of tomorrow that will never ever be complete. It will always be showcasing and testing and demonstrating new materials and new systems. It was a visionary city of the future that he saw, and he longed to see it built. But others around him, they thought his vision was a little bit like far-fetched, maybe a little bit too fantastical. Behind his back, people would call this place Waltopia, from the Greek word utopia, meaning no place. And they just thought, man, how will this ever happen? How will this vision, how will this dream ever be realized? And so after his unexpected death in 1966-ish, somewhere around there, the executives, they began to take Walt's like just, madman kind of dream about this futuristic city in the world. And they began to look at it from like a narrow point of view of like economics and operations and technology and that kind of a thing. And they streamlined it so that when Epcot finally opened in 1982, instead of like a stream of residents commuting to their first day of work in this beautiful new city, it was more like a sea of tourists that walked beneath the belly of this large, odd-looking spaceship Earth. And they were there to buy souvenirs and intake fabricated experiences for themselves. And the grand city of tomorrow, it never lived beyond Walt Disney's imagination and his dreams. It became a theme park, a pragmatic, safe, proven place that managers and stockholders could embrace. And I apologize for any of you who like Epcot, but studies have shown that Epcot is the least favorite theme park of all of Disney World. It's this weird thing sitting there in the middle of all these awesome, fun places. You know, I think Walt would roll over in his grave to see what has become of it. And for many people, it has become the subject of ridicule and mockery, like I am doing right now. PJ at work is a comedian, and he said this about Epcot. He said, with Epcot Center, the Disney Corporation has accomplished something I didn't think was possible in today's world. They have created a land of make-believe that is worse than real life. It's the saddest thing I've ever heard, you know? And this gleaming pearl of a golf ball, it sits over the horizon of Central Florida's landscape, and it is a reminder of a fantastic dream for the future that was never realized. There is a way in which failure, the loss of relationship, the distancing of ourselves from Jesus, the great visionary of our lives, it causes us to settle, to disqualify ourselves from his mission. And maybe we keep the name Christian, and maybe we still call ourselves Jesus followers, but we go back to some kind of emasculated life that does not come close to the incredible, almost unbelievable life that Jesus offers us, where we get a new name, and we get purpose, and we get destiny, and we get invited into his work to seek and save the lost. And some of you, just this week or just this year, you have begun to dream, to believe for the first time maybe that you could have some kind of role in God's work of redemption and restoration on your campus. That maybe, just possibly, you could take more risks to invite your friends into environments where they could get to know Jesus. That maybe perhaps you could lead a small group or reach a specific group of students on campus, or that you could take greater risks to talk about Jesus crucified and resurrected. Maybe you've begun to dream about the fact that you could actually care spiritually for younger students in your fellowship, that you could reach out to people from different cultural backgrounds than yourself. Maybe for the first time you have begun to hope that Jesus is going to include you in his work in the world. And as a warning, a word of warning, a word of love to you, failure will come. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it will happen. You and I, post-salvation moment with Jesus, will screw up again. It's going to happen. It may happen next week. It may happen over the summer. I had a friend in college, he had this one just really wretched summer with Jesus. He called it the summer of suck. That's what he called it. It could happen this summer. It could happen next year. And you may come back in the fall to your fellowship and be tempted to settle for Epcot. To lose sight.
Oh, it's so bad.
For some emasculated version of the dreams that God has breathed into you this week, you may lose sight of the hopes that he has for your participation in his mission in the world and on campus. But guys, there is good news, because Jesus is not okay with you living an emasculated version of the hopes and dreams that he has planted in your heart this week. He is not okay with it. And there is this beautiful thing happening in the passage between Jesus and the disciples and Peter. But at some point, we just have to stop and marvel at Jesus in this passage, because he blows me away when I look at this. He is not okay with the fact that Peter has gone back to fishing. And Peter, let's get it straight. Peter and the disciples are being disobedient in this passage. They were asked by Jesus to stay in Jerusalem, and they left. And yet Jesus comes to them in the midst of their running and their hiding and their disobedience. And Jesus is the one standing on the shore of the lake that day when they are out in the boat fishing again. Jesus is the one calling out to them, have you caught anything tonight, guys? How's it going for you? And this scene is dripping with meaning, you guys. Jesus is the one that gives them a catch that night again. And he is the one who prepares the meal. And he is the one that initiates and begins asking Peter those important questions. And when I see Jesus in this passage, my heart leaps, guys. It wants to shout that I would give anything for the surpassing greatness of knowing this Jesus, who stands on the shore of our weakest, darkest moment in life and begins to call out to us again. You have got to get the beauty of this scene. This is like a theater of restoration just for Peter. And every ounce of this scene is dripping with meaning. It's breathtaking, you guys. Don't you know when Jesus stands on that shore and he asks them, are you catching anything? And these expert fishermen who have been out all night, they say no. Don't you remember that moment happening before? And he tells them, why don't you just put out on the other side? And it has the potential to be a rude statement, right, from a non-fisherman to a group of expert fishermen. But they put out on the other side, and what happens? Their nets are full, overwhelmed, right? And there's this awesome thing, it triggers something. I just imagine in a movie we would be watching flashbacks at this point, and it triggers something in the heart of John, the disciple that Jesus loved. And he tells Peter, it's the Lord. It's the Lord, Peter. And Peter's naked for some reason in the passage. I don't know why. Fishing naked. It's about freedom, I guess. So I don't think you have to get undressed to jump in the water. He has to get a little dressed. He wraps something around himself. And Peter, in another and this is like the beauty of Peter's impulsiveness. Because, he has just got to feel the distance from Jesus. And maybe all along his heart has been longing to be near him, but afraid and fearful that it couldn't happen. And he hears that it's the Lord, you guys, and he jumps in the water and he begins to swim towards Jesus. It's beautiful. And this theater, it is set in every way. Jesus has made a charcoal fire. John gives us these details. It's not just a fire, it's a specific kind of fire. It's a charcoal fire. And don't you know that the last time Peter was probably by a charcoal fire was that night when that little girl asked him if he knew Jesus, and he said he did not. And Jesus has prepared that fire to make a meal for him. And Jesus is there with bread and with fish. And don't you imagine that he would remember that Last Supper with Jesus, when Jesus was there washing their feet, when the God of the universe was there cleaning the dirt off their feet and serving them food. And don't you think Peter and the disciples remember that moment? And Jesus, the Master, again, in this scene, is serving them. It is so significant. And I think it must have been significant too, because I wonder if that supper, that night when Jesus washed their feet, was the last time Peter felt really close to Jesus. Felt really sure of his relationship with him. And so Jesus brings him into that moment. And then there's this painful, awkward scene in the company of friends where Jesus asks him these 3 difficult questions, and he calls him Simon again. Like that night when Simon said, I will never deny you, and he says, Simon, Simon. He asks him these 3 questions, and he calls him Simon. And he says, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And there is this beautiful theater set for the work of Peter's restoration back into relationship with Jesus and his mission in the world. And Peter is there feeling like a total loser. And he knows Jesus has something big he wants to do. I don't know if you've read the book of Acts, but there's a lot coming. And there is something really beautiful that Jesus is about to accomplish in the world, and he wants this loser involved in it. And so we see this scene of restoration that is set up just for Peter. And we're like Peter, aren't we? We think, I have screwed up. Jesus is alive, but I am an idiot. I am weak. I cannot be useful to him. I cannot be wanted by him. And yet we learn from Jesus in this scene that for him, failure does not negate our calling.
Amen.
In some ways, failure may even define our calling.
Amen.
I was listening to someone talk about the great German composer Ludwig von Beethoven this week. And I don't know how many of you know much about him. All the music majors are just loving it tonight.
Yes. Right here. Finally gets. Yes.
Anyways, I'm just going to geek out on you for a minute. So I was thinking about this guy. I don't know how much you know about Beethoven, but he was really a prodigy. By the time he was, at the age of 13, I think, he composed his first 3 piano sonatas. People were just in awe of him as a pianist. Before he was a composer, he was just like an amazing piano player. I still don't know if anyone has ever existed since then who could play the piano the way that Beethoven played the piano. And from a very early age, he began to write pieces that would just showcase the sound of the piano and what he could do there. And he really came up under the shadow of these other 2 composers, Haydn and Mozart. And I don't know how much you know about Mozart, but he was kind of a flash in the pan. He was like young, he was totally brilliant, wrote a lot of incredible music, but he lived this kind of like crazy party life, and he died really young. And Beethoven really never got the chance to like learn from him or study under him. But he really lived in these guys' shadows for a long time when he was young. But after the death of Mozart, Beethoven moved to Vienna and became one of the premier pianists there at that time. When he was about 27 or 28, he began to lose his hearing. And by the time he was 30, he was completely deaf. This piano prodigy could not hear one note on a piano anymore. And this guy was special, guys. His music was special. What he was doing was really, really special. But the loss of his hearing, it just created like all this shame in him. He was so embarrassed about being deaf that he withdrew from society. He kind of became like a misanthrope, really isolated. He hid from people and he would write music, but he didn't want anyone to know that he was deaf. And he was kind of a tragic guy. He lived this very lonely life from there on out. He was kind of like that typical tortured artist that you always think about, just like everything in life was really difficult. And this guy never really found love. He loved a lot of women who never ever loved him back. And he wrote a lot of music. Isn't it sad? He wrote, like, the Moonlight Sonata, like many of his pieces were written for women that he adored and loved, but never really returned his affections. And one of the last symphonies he wrote was Symphony No. 9. I don't know if you've ever heard this piece of music before, but it is an incredible piece of music. It's massive. It's extraordinary. It's the first symphony, I think, that ever included voices, and it began to change, like swing the eras of music from classical to romantic, and everybody wanted to do what Beethoven had done after this piece. And just the fourth movement alone of that piece of music is like a symphony within a symphony. It is so complex and so beautiful. You should listen to it if you've never heard it or if you haven't listened to it recently. It was very out of the box. It was really different. And people that wrote about him at the time, critics that wrote about him, they said it sounded like the writings of a madman because they had just never heard anything like this before. And he wrote this piece of music and all the other music for the rest of his life completely deaf, never hearing one note of what he was writing except what he imagined in his head as he composed it. The first time that they ever played the Ninth Symphony, he was there, and they performed it, and it ended, and this piece of music got 5 standing ovations, but he had no clue. He hadn't heard one note of the entire piece. Someone had to come up and turn him to the audience so that this man who had been so lonely and so isolated because of the shame of his deafness could turn and see how people were admiring this piece of music that he had written. And I just wonder, how did a deaf man accomplish this? How could he dream up and write this kind of music, never hearing one note except what was in his head? And Beethoven was a religious man, and he one of the last things that he began to write about, he began to write and say that there was something that God, the Creator, had put inside of him, and he just could not die until he found a way to get it out. It was like a conversation that he was having with God in this isolated place of his shame and hiddenness from the world, where God was whispering to him. And I don't know if it was because of his deafness and being closed into his head that he could more clearly hear Jesus, but it was something about his deafness that created a kind of desperation. And in that place, you guys, this piece of music was born as God began to whisper into his ears. Maybe it was his deafness that created that solidarity with God in his head to be able to write this piece of music that he wanted the world to hear. His deafness, his greatest place of shame, became the source of his greatest gift to the world. And I want you to know tonight that it is possible that your calling is tied up with some of your greatest failures. It often comes to us in places we don't expect it. I heard someone say recently that Peter was definitely, without doubt, the worst candidate among all of the 12 disciples to be a pastor. This is not the guy you want to give the title shepherd to, He is so impulsive, and when tense moments come up, he cuts people's ears off, and it's like, really? That guy? You want him to be a pastor? You want him to be a shepherd? All the qualities of the worst pastor ever, and yet he is called by Jesus to be a nurturer of people. And we already know he's impulsive and he can't be depended on as he's young in his relationship with Jesus, but Jesus called him a rock. He gave him that name. And somewhere in this place of failure, I think it was a turning point for Peter, where he, in this deepest, darkest moment of failure, began to grasp the meaning of what it meant to be a rock. Someone that was dependable, who could be depended on, who could be worked alongside of and trusted, because he had not been those things that night before. Guys, our mission on campus is real, and I believe that what staff workers are doing and what you are doing on campus is the most important thing happening in the university world. And you may feel too weak sometimes to get involved, and maybe those of you who are involved and you're leading small groups or helping lead in the chapter, maybe you look at your work and you're tempted sometimes to think that, you struggle to see the worth in it. You're just not sure if it's really making a difference, And maybe when it's time for you to do gigs or proxy stations or to share your faith, maybe what you see is a really scary situation that you have to work up your nerve and your courage to go into and just hope you don't lose face or lose friends, as you start talking about Jesus. But the truth is, guys, in that moment, there is this moment ripe with opportunity for the voice of God to break through space and time and bring people who are distant from him near to him again. And maybe when you go to your small groups or your large groups, or for some of us our oddly medium-sized large groups, maybe you're tempted to feel like we're kind of awkward. I mean, have you ever felt that way? I felt that way in my church. I'm like, we're kind of awkward people. I'm not sure why people want to hang out with us. We do weird dances, and our music is good sometimes, and sometimes our program is okay, and you're tempted to feel insecure about that. And so you see the awkwardness, but what could really exist, you guys, is a community of healing and of hope, where your fellowship gets the opportunity to be the kiss of God to a wounded campus. Maybe it is in the place of our greatest deafness. Maybe this is the place of our greatest desperation for God. And can we let Jesus come to us in our weakest moment and speak words of life that will transform us and enable us to take risks to join him in his mission on campus? The worship team can start making their way up. I have just a little bit more left that I want to share with you. The end of this, passage, as Jesus confronts Peter and he begins to ask him those three questions. It's a painful moment, you guys, and I think there's something there. I'm not going to go into it, but there is something here about the restoration, particularly of leaders who have failed. And as I hear Jesus asking him that question, Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And there is this sense that Jesus does not allow for the dichotomy that we get caught in sometimes of discipleship first and then mission. He does not call Peter into some four-step discipleship process so he can get his life back together, and then maybe one day he'll be useful again. And there is this tense moment of maybe we can turn it down just a little bit, of Jesus wanting to restore Peter, and it's awkward, you guys. It's super awkward because he's in front of all of his friends. And it wasn't that he just betrayed Jesus, but he broke relationship with his friends. And Jesus is asking in front of all his friends, Simon, do you love me? And I just imagine their friends are so awkward. They're shuffling their feet in the sand, and they're can't believe Jesus is doing this right now. Let's just get on to the love fest, please. And it's three painful times, and we don't like that. We have a hard time dealing with failure, and we're not sure how to restore people. And this isn't even my point, but we do have to learn to be communities that can bring our failures out into the open in a place that is safe and be honest and expose how we've hurt each other and how we've broken trust with each other. And we need to be communities where that can be brought out, and then people can be restored back into God's community and back into his mission. And for Jesus, there isn't this dichotomy necessarily of discipleship and then mission. And we don't even have time for that because people are dying on our campuses. Jesus is calling Peter to be devoted to him in the setting of community and mission. To love him, to worship him, to meditate on him in the context of community and mission. And there is this profound image of feeding sheep, of a shepherd. And I don't know what you recall when you think of what it means to be a shepherd, but there are multiple passages that come to mind for me, like when Jesus and the disciples were there, and he fed the 5,000, and they're all crowded around listening to his teacher, and it says Jesus looked at them, and he saw them helpless and harassed like sheep without a shepherd. And he had compassion on them, and he began to feed them. And then that shepherd, that passage where he says, I am the good shepherd, and he talks about what it means to be a good shepherd and what it looks like to be a hired hand. And being a good shepherd to his people is so important to Jesus. And like Taylor said last night, Jesus is a revelation into the heart of God. And being a good shepherd to his people, that is close to God's heart. And I remember Ezekiel 34, I don't know if you've read this passage, where Israel's leaders, the religious leaders, the shepherds, they were doing a bad job. They were eating their sheep. They were exploiting the people that God had put under their care. And it was so important to God. They did not get this wrong that he said, forget it. I will take that job myself. If you cannot do it the way that I want it to be done, I will care for my people. And he said, this is what he says in Ezekiel, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself, I will search for my sheep and I will look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on the day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel and the ravines and all the settlements of the land. I will tend to them in good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed on the rich pasture of the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend to these sheep. I will have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring them back. Bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. And when Jesus invites this broken man, Peter, into the task of caring for his sheep, you have to know it is such an important role that is so close to the heart of God. And how incredible, you guys, that as broken, messed up people, Jesus would invite us into the role of feeding sheep. Can you believe it? Can you wrap your mind around that? I've heard stories from you guys this week about your campuses, and I've heard stories from your own mouth about receiving death threats, about sexual abuse and sexual brokenness, about depression and suicidal tendencies. I've heard about classrooms that shake you to the core with their skepticism and their outright rejection of even the possibility that Jesus was who he said he was. I've heard stories of friends with real demonic spiritual oppression, and I've seen it in the schools that I supervise in Tampa. We have had a student in one of my schools that sold one of her friends for sex to a guy at her door because she wanted money to pay for a plane ticket so her and her friend can hang out. I have seen students come close to mental illness, living as functional alcoholics on campus. I've watched students on one of my campuses be interviewed about the Saturday morning walk of shame that has become the norm for young women, giving themselves away to men they have just met. And don't you know that Jesus looks at our universities and our community colleges and our campuses, and he sees sheep without a shepherd. He sees people helpless and harassed, in need of a good shepherd who will seek and save the lost. Students, for you tonight, I wonder, can you hear the voice of Jesus asking you that question? Can you hear him whispering to you, do you love me? Feed my sheep. It's not a question of salvation. It's a question of restoration, of mission, of calling. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. He isn't asking for offerings. He doesn't want penance from you or elaborate religious rituals. He wants you to love, to serve, to create opportunities for others on your campus to encounter Jesus and make a decision about him. And he's asking you the question tonight, do you love me? Feed my sheep. As we begin to respond to Jesus tonight, I wonder, are you able to offer yourself in all of your weakness to him for the sake of a dying campus? Can you trust and believe tonight that Jesus is calling you in all of your frailty, in all of your fragility, to walk alongside him and to care for students on your campus. Maybe it's through just becoming more bold and inviting people to come to Bible studies with you, or to your Common Ground event, or to hang out with you and your Christian friends, or maybe it is to lead a small group, to take a risk to lead a gig into a Bible study with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Take risks to share your faith more. Maybe it's to be bold in the way that you help serve a large group. Maybe it's praying and asking Jesus to help you discover a particular group of people on campus that he wants you to reach. I don't know what it is for you, but are you ready tonight to offer yourself in weakness for the mission of God on your campus? So I want to give you 2 ways to respond tonight. The first group, if you sense tonight that you for some reason you look at your campus and you just you're not broken. You don't feel compassion when you look at them. You don't sense the burden of Jesus for your campus. If you're in that place tonight, maybe you just need to begin to cry out to him, to let you see the university through his eyes. And if that's you tonight, grab a friend next to you and just confess to them, my heart is not moved with compassion. Will you pray for me to have the compassion of Jesus for my campus? And for the rest of you, I'm going to ask the staff to begin to stand up around the edges of the room. And if you tonight have sensed Jesus during this week calling you deeper into his work on campus, and you really, even if you're scared and you're afraid and you're not sure what it means yet, practically speaking, but if you're ready to offer yourself in weakness for his work on campus, then as a step of faith, I just want to ask you to go to one of the staff. It can be your staff or someone else's staff around you, and just let them pray for you. Let them pray a prayer of blessing over you, staff. It can just be a brief prayer of blessing and for God to set them apart for his work on campus. And I think this is such an